The CMS Migration Scholars Series is brought to you by the Center for Migration Studies of New York. In the first of this series, we interview Gemma Tulud Cruz, Senior Lecturer in the School of Theology at Australian Catholic University. In this interview, Dr. Cruz discusses her past scholarship and current project Faith on the Move, Christianity and the Intercultural Church. The project is a theological investigation of the challenges and opportunities that Christianity in general, and Catholicism in particular, faced and continue to face in the context of the migration of Christians in the past and in contemporary times, in view of developing a concept of an intercultural church. Dr. Cruz visited CMS in June 2015 to gather information for her project using CMS's publications, archive collections, and our U.S. Catholic Institutions and Immigrant Integration Initiative.
My project looks especially at the parish, which is the microcosm of the church. And to me, it's beyond ministries, it's beyond the services, it's beyond the pastoral dimension, but more of the internal. So the project seems to me does a lot of the external, the focus on schools, hospitals, charities, services. But to me, I want to also explore the internal. So it's not just like the Gaudium et Spes in Vatican II, which is the church in the modern world, but also the Lumen Gentium, which is more inward-looking, the structures of the church. And in the parish, for instance, in terms of equity, the representation of the immigrant members of the church, are they part of the parish pastoral council? What type of enculturation do we have? Is it just reading the first reading in Spanish and then the gospel in English? Those are just, to me, the first layers, the first steps. What about the more in decision-making areas and structures in the parish? How are immigrants represented? What's their voice in it? So that they have a seat at the table. So liturgy for also, how do we enculturate? Those sort of things. The kind of hospitality, is it? I have this colleague, a Latino theologian, who put it really very starkly. What kind of hospitality are we offering to the immigrants? Is it like, yeah, we give them the church the space to celebrate the Eucharist, but what time do we give them? We give them a place to meet. It's the basement, and we have the key. So those kinds of questions, or even the idea of in the website I've seen between natives and newcomers. What do we mean by newcomers? Are we still referring to people who have been here for generations? Are we still referring to Latinos, for instance, say we've always been part of this country? It's just the border that moved. So maybe also, so in terms of, for us academics and research, it is the kind of probably the critique of the language we use, the approach we take. That's the contribution that people like theologians can contribute to the project. And I've seen you rope in some good ones like Brett Hoover, his good book, and I found that helpful. In fact, I was alerted to his recent book by your website, which is The Shared Parish, and that will be an excellent source for me. Yeah. How do we bring down this framework, which is Catholic social teaching, for example, because these are great ideas, but in terms of how do we really bring them down so that we influence policy decision makers? So that is the main challenge, I think, for Catholic social teaching, and that's one of the issues I've raised. How do we really make it concrete to influence and really make a difference, because it has a reputation of being the best kept secret of the church. Great ideas in books, in bookshelves, we talk about it, but it's quite hard to really put it into action. And in that session, I think there's one great idea that we could take from it, which is our schools and our universities' education. Education as a means into bringing these great words into action, bringing them into life by looking at how our education, how we educate our lawyers, our students who become politicians, into this whole the Catholic social principles: common good, the dignity of the human person, solidarity. So those are some of the ways in which it intersects into the discourse on migration. But one of the things I also work at in relation to Catholic social teaching is actually the gender aspect, which is women. And you go through Catholic social teaching, especially the earlier ones, there's not much voice of women. Even the language itself, when you talk about the migrant, it's not really the woman that they have in mind, but it is really the man. So, and we're moving into that. There's of course progress, but there is still that need to more fully integrate the experience and perspective of women in Catholic society, including migrant women. As compared to the past, there are more and more women who are moving, who are on the move today. Because before it was primarily the male who moves and then sends the money, and then the woman is left behind to take care of the children. But today there are more women on the move, but particularly in Asia, in countries like the Philippines, in Sri Lanka, in Indonesia, where we have what we call the feminization of migration, where the majority of workers or citizens on the move are women. In 1 year alone, for instance, in the Philippines, as much as 60% of those who move are women. In Indonesia, the ratio, in 1 year, I was reading that Asian and Pacific Migration Journal, which is also Scalabrini related, 4:1. So, in that sense, there is really a need to integrate the experience and perspective of women in articulating a theology of migration, because for them it's a different experience. And also because migration is bringing something good to women also. So in as much as is, we call it old challenges, new contexts and strategies. That's the title actually on the chapter on women in my recent book, Toward the Theology of Migration. Because these women, some of them, or a good number of them, particularly from the global south, come from patriarchal societies. And for them, migration can be a means for empowerment, for greater freedom, for greater voice in the family. Because even if they come from a family, for instance, when they become the breadwinners, so they're not just dependents now, but they become breadwinners of their families, they also have a voice in their family. So even their father and their mother, usually the father has the absolute voice, but they acquire a certain sense of power. So it becomes a means of empowerment also for women. At the same time, we are also seeing the exacerbation of old gender inequalities or experience of violence of women. So we see in Hong Kong, for example, I don't know if you have heard of that Indonesian woman who was won a case against her employer because she was really subjected to severe abuse. It was horrible. She was even made to wear diapers, so she doesn't have to go to the toilet, and she was padded all the way through. So even when people touch her, she will not, because she's bruised all over. So lots of horrible experience. Yeah, so women can play a very important role in articulating a theology of migration. It depends on the country. Like when you're talking of Middle Eastern countries, for instance, it's an entirely different issue, because in the first place, the church is absent, or even if the church is there, it can be invisible, because like in Saudi Arabia, for instance, you cannot even gather for mass, so much less when can you put up services with a Christian or faith-based aspect to it. I remember I attended this when I was still teaching in the Philippines. Even before I started doing research on migration, I used to teach in an exclusive school for women run by nuns, and I brought them as a part of their educational experience, exposure to what we call the pre-departure orientation for domestic workers going to the Middle East. So it's run by the Good Shepherd sisters. So my students and I, about 10 of them, sat in the session, and literally the nun was telling them, those who are going to Saudi Arabia, do not bring Bible, rosaries, or any religious articles. So it depends on the host country. But if you talk like of Hong Kong, for instance, it's an entirely different picture. In fact, in Hong Kong, there's what you call the Diocesan Pastoral Center for Filipinos. And I've been there, and you have a whole lot of services for women, including those who are victims of violence. There's a hotline, there's a shelter for them. I went to a shelter, for example, of those women who have been abused. So it depends on what country. It's a good question. Challenges, I think, if they are in the minority. So let's say if they're Christians and they're in a Christian minority, when they are a minority. So, and also in terms of the reality of immigration is that when you come to a new country, you're looking for something familiar, someone who looks familiar, something that tastes familiar, something that smells familiar. So if I am, for instance, I have come across this text, for instance, of Argentinian Catholics, I think it's in Florida, because there's no, not so much, I think wherever there's no Catholic church or there's no Argentinian priest, so he attended the Protestant church. So there is also a shift in the dynamics of religious identity, because if there are no services, or if they have no priest coming from their own country who speaks their language. So that's one of the challenge, because that's normally the first level of adjustment, ethnic affiliation. Second one, I think, is language also, still is a factor. And the attitude of the local population, the economic, social, political condition, because these are always intertwined in the life of a person. We can never dissociate my faith life with what's happening to me when I go out of my house, when I ride the bus, when I go to my workplace and experience racism and discrimination. So that's why this project that you have is actually very important. I find it very important in terms of the multi-sectoral approach to it, that we're not only looking at the parish, the church, but also looking at schools, universities, charities, hospitals. My only comment probably is that there also has to be enough focus on what's happening in the parish, because the Catholic Church has done so much. You can see it written in books. There are lots of documents in terms of services. It has done excellent work. You know, the mere fact that we have all these Catholic schools, Catholic hospitals, Catholic charities has done so much. But maybe it's also time to look at what's happening in the parish. Are we giving them enough voice and space? That we have to aim for really coming together, to come out of our own enclaves religiously, and really become the church on the Pentecost, people of different cultures. And I think the church is more beautiful in that way. The church is more faithful to its identity in that way. The church is more faithful to the vision of Vatican II in that way, because it is at Vatican II that we, for the first time, saw the world church, when the bishops who came from the different parts of the world are really, most of them will be born from that part of the world. Unlike the First Vatican Council, the bishop who came from India is actually, say, a British, and the bishop who came from one country in Africa is really a German. First Vatican Council, but Second Vatican Council, it's the beginning of a universal church, and especially with this shift of demographics from the global north to the global south. I think there really is something that much to learn about, really having that fullest potential of the church. So what you see here, and this is part of the whole exploration of the idea of the intercultural church, it's not just the members but also the priests, the formation of the priests into the immigrant culture. It's not just about them knowing how to speak their language, but also knowing and appreciating their culture. Because if it's just a case of, oh, as long as they don't get in my way, I can do what I want, then it's okay. But it also really is not just the members, but also the priest, the church interacting and also changing in the process, being transformed by the experience in the process. I was talking to this person who works very much with migrant services, And she's saying that she went to this seminar, and the priest who is ministering to a immigrant parish said that, oh, I have this group. At first, I was telling them what to do. They don't follow. They just continue what they want to do. So I let them be. But that's not also the case, I think. Because if you let them be, then they will be in their comfort zones. The idea of the intercultural church is to go out of your comfort zones and meet the other members of the family of God and celebrate the faith together, worship together, and be in solidarity in the quest for well-being of one another. Because the church at the end of the day is becoming human together, becoming God's people together, becoming Christian together. Actually, before coming here, when I was working in this article that on what did I work? Yeah, I was working on mission and power. I came across this article in the New York Times in Chinatown. The church there, which is now predominantly Chinese, the history there is fascinating. How it started with, I don't know who came first. The Germans, the Irish, and the Italians, and then came the Chinese. And the Chinese, that church would have been closed, it would, or probably dying today had it not been for the Chinese. I once heard a story that in San Francisco there's a Filipino church there. It would have also kind of died, or at least really just struggling, but the Filipinos also kind of revived it. There's lots of stories, even in Europe, especially in Europe, of Africans. In fact, this is not Catholic, but one of the largest, probably even largest, one of the largest Christian group in the UK today is founded by a Nigerian, 25,000. And one in Ukraine, also founded by, these are Pentecostal church, of course. And that one in Ukraine is a perfect example because the members, a lot of them are Ukrainians, and they come from across the country. But of course, because they're speaking to the psychosocial, emotional needs of people. You know, you probably have heard of Pentecostalism, so it's a whole different approach to Christianity. But there are so many stories of churches being revived by the energy, the spirituality, the vitality, and the commitment, because the commitment is still there of immigrants to go to church. In the Netherlands, when I was living there, I went to a church in Amsterdam and I saw El Shaddai, you know, the Filipino Catholic charismatic group. Then you see the tourists just walking around the church, but they kind of revived the church to that certain extent. But I also want to put it out there that I don't want to valorize popular piety, because we know there's also that's also open to criticism, that it needs of a kind of a renewal. It needs a kind of there are some elements to it that also needs to be reconsidered.